Naranjo liked to explore ideas. And when I met him in 1996, he said that he stopped teaching for 24 years because of the misinformation and the conflicts that were occurring in the community. And he didn't teach in the US literally until this training, this SAT intensive in Boulder, Colorado in 1996. And I had the good fortune of being able to get in. Now, I'd seen him speak, but it's very different spending a 10-day intensive versus just a presentation. He explained that prior to 1996, he'd never taught the full set, that people were taking what he'd said a little here, a little there, and then making it like the truth. But he said some of them weren't quite right. And he didn't teach people in large numbers. He would work with groups, especially in psychoanalytic groups. But he didn't teach then for 24 years. But after reading my research, he said it was accurate and that it had filled in the little areas where he wasn't so certain. Naranjo really liked my research because it validated that he was the seminal force, that it all came from him because he wasn't given attribution. It had been mistakenly attributed to Achazo. And he also liked that of the 27 examples of the subtypes, he hadn't worked them all out. But because I had worked at that time with people and I had every single combination, he felt it filled in things for him and wanted to teach the subtypes, which he had not planned in that intensive, but he wanted me to add my research throughout as he covered that segment of the intensive. And I thought, well, sure. I was very happy to share it. I was still researching. And at that point, I had 2 years of research. But long story short, when I worked with people in the in-depth inquiry, I discovered that they had the three types, I call them three types. And because they had the idealized image, the core fears, and the defense strategies of three types, not just one. And it was very noteworthy. Even if they had a fourth type, because they couldn't decide in a center, they still had one from each center. And they didn't know they were centers at that time.
In other words, Naranjo didn't use Tritype back then.
No,
He had
no.
these buckets. That's what explains, for example, why Naranjo tried to attribute the counterphobic instincts to the instinct. Because often the sexual 6, for example, will have the 8 in the Tritype.
Yeah.
And so on. And so, since he didn't use Tritype, then he came up with the idea that it was the instinct, the main decider. Actually, is the gut preferred in the Tritype that influence more, and then yes, the sexual is often more with 8 and so on.
Yeah, a sexual 6 and have 8 in the Tritype. They're very easy to spot because it's congruent. But what happened is, okay, so one thing is that when I asked him if he considered that to be true, that there was a countertypes for all 9 types and that there were 3 and they were in a stacking order of significance. The first being the most stereotypical example of the type. And then the second and third were countertypes, but the one was more atypical than the other. And so when I asked him initially, he thought I was saying, is there a counterphobic of each type? And then he was saying, no, people have asked me that for years, and the phobic is only for the head type. And I said, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about they would be counter envy for the 4. So in each case, it would be counter the issue, not phobic. And he said, oh, that he'd never thought about that. And so he wanted to know what I thought as we went through each combination. And I had said they're in a hierarchical order. And and you have the stereotype, and then one that's, you know, a little different, and then one that's very different in the way it looks. Still, they have the core fear of their Enneagram type, but then it's combined with the core fear of the instinctual type, which creates these unusual combinations. So, for example, with the 5, the description of 5 at the time was that you compartmentalize, you isolate as a defense strategy, and that you can struggle with having avarice and stinginess. The way he described it, it's a hoarding of the self, and would rather not be obligated to anyone. And so, and withholding the self. And yet, so that would be the stereotype, or what he called the archetype of type 5. But the countertype was the sexual 5, because they're in search of their beloved and this like ideal, like in the mind beloved, and their passion. And so they want to fuse and merge with their ideal, but then they find themselves like flawed and imperfect, so that it would contaminate that ideal love. And so it looks different. Like, that's why the word confidence he used to describe the sexual 5. But then there's another countertype of 5, which is the social 5, from the standpoint that they don't just isolate, they try to find the groups of people that have the exclusivity, and they can be involved at a distance. They don't have to be fully involved. And like, for example, when the internet became common and people were posting on it, the 5s enjoyed having internet groups because they didn't have to respond emotionally. They could just type. So we would say that, or what I found working with people, is the stereotype was the self-pres 5, because it fit all the descriptors of type 5, you know, smart, avoidant, conceptual, rational, logical, impersonal, and valuing knowledge more than emotional relating. In fact, they use the word emotional entanglements. I'd never heard that before, but I heard it from the 5s, that they didn't want uncomfortable emotional entanglements, that they felt like they weren't equipped to have an emotional conversation because it was irrational. Now, these are all stereotypes, but anyhow, that would be the stereotype, or what Naranjo called the archetype of type 5. But when he added the subversions, suborientations, then when you mix the need of the 5 to be separate and away with the need of the sexual that needs union and fusion, then you have someone that is going back and forth in brief, intense interaction, but then needing distance and ease. Okay, so that would be the 2 extremes. But the second countertype is the social, where they have this drive to be with like-minded people, but if they're irrational or illogical, it's very frustrating to them. And so they go back and forth. So that's why I always saw 2 countertypes, a stereotype and 2 countertypes for every type. What he said to me was that he really thought there was something to countertypes for all the types, and he added it to his teachings. But if he was asked to list them, then he would just go with the most obvious countertype and didn't do the second one, because he felt like most people didn't understand anyhow, that it was better just to give them the information. It could take an hour to go through all 27 countertypes. So, for example, at the IEA conference in 2004, when someone asked the very same question, hey, are there counterphobic types for all the types? And he goes, no, but there are countertypes. So that was the first time that he publicly talked about it that I know of. And then he only did 1 round And then he was on something with Ship Network, and he only did the most obvious countertypes, but he did add 2 countertypes for type 1. So the thing is, especially with an INTP, they're not rigidly going to do something the exact way. But yeah, he validated the concept of countertypes once he understood that I was talking about the actual passion and fixation of each type. Then he really, really liked it, because he never went that far with it. He just wanted to distinguish the difference between the phobic and the counterphobic 6. But I use countertypes because he used the word counter in counterphobic. So it made sense to me. So that was one thing. And so that's why in the book, I include a chart showing the ranking. And then the amazing part is when you figure out your tritype, and then you look at what types you have and are they countertypes or not.